good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. I am Stephanie Van Vark, and I am a small business owner. And welcome to Just Talking Business, a podcast for entrepreneurs. Our hope is when you're listening to this podcast, you are learning a wealth of information about how to start up correctly and scale up correctly. I have to laugh a little bit. My husband went in and changed the intro. If any of you have been following me, I didn't realize how many different hairstyles I'd had over the course of this year. So that's really funny. Thank you for tuning in. It's been fun to watch all the different hairstyles. So today is a very important show. I cannot stress as a small business owner how important it is to make sure you are very aware of the legal ramifications of being a small business owner. And there are so many challenges in that realm that I'm excited to bring this young woman on because she is going to kind of help us decipher where those moments are important. Her name is Daniela Cimo, Esquire. She works with Legal Services of Greater Miami, and I'm gonna bring her on and let her tell us all about who she is and what she does, and then gives us some tips on how to think through our legal strategy. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Stephanie. How are you?
Thank you for agreeing to come today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So if you'll tell us really quickly who you are and what you do.
Sure. So Daniela Cimo, I grew up here in Miami-Dade County. I went to college in Washington, D.C. I studied political communication there. And it was there that I got really interested in just helping and wanting to support people who don't have access to the type of support that I did growing up, whether it's economic or just having access to different professionals that can help you excel in your life. And so I ended up here at Legal Services of Greater Miami after law school, where I've been supporting nonprofit organizations, mostly 501c3 charities, and small business owners like yourself. Mm-hmm. And what I do at Legal Services is I provide transactional legal support. So that means we help small business owners with starting up their business, and then anything, in between, from startup all the way to running your business, growing your business, sometimes winding up the business, also resolving disputes sometimes between owners or with lenders. So that's some of the work that I do.
Oh, very cool. I didn't even know that dispute part. And yes, I am a client, by the way. So I highly recommend going, just because I've learned so many things in this whole scale up mode. So in your bio, I sort of read that you assist, as you mentioned, business formation, contract drafting and negotiations, real estate and business transactions. Can you sort of give us sort of a roundabout global definition of what a business formation would be? Not specifics, but what a business formation would be, what contract drafting would be, what kind of business transactions in particular you would be looking at?
Sure. So when it comes to business formation, we typically, at Legal Services, we have many different partners that we work with. There are so many resources out there right now for small businesses. I know the county and Daniela Levine Cava, our mayor, are spearheading supporting small businesses in the county, right? Mm-hmm. And so for the past couple of years, we've been working with partners like Startup FIU Food, the folks at Venture Cafe, which they're now Air Ventures. Mm-hmm. And so those small business incubators or resources will send us clients. And by the time that we get the client and do our intake and consultation, we are assisting the business, if it's a startup, with looking at their business plan, right? Mm-hmm. And saying, okay, how can we help you structure your business? And so that's what the sort of the startup phase looks like. It's us reviewing your business plan with you, and then helping you to determine the best legal structure for your business. So, for example, if you're not operating with a business entity and you're just Stephanie Van Vark doing business as Stephanie Van Vark, or maybe you have a DBA as another doing, or you have a fictitious name, right, as your company name. But if you don't have a separate legal entity, then you are liable for anything, for the debts and obligations of the business.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we help small business owners do is transition from, working as a sole proprietor where they have no limit on their liability to helping them create a company that will help them to limit that liability. Because ultimately, as a business, you have a liability not only to the IRS and the government, but you could have liability with anyone that you're working with, your clients. Somebody slips and falls at your, in your office space. So it's a way of protecting yourself as the business owner and, creating an entity that can actually be the business, right? And then I guess the next step is always, once we've identified a legal structure, we have to look at, what is your role in the business? Are you an owner? Are you and your husband 50-50 owners? Are you just going to be an employee of the business? And so trying to figure those things out with the small business client is what we do. And a lot of that is just asking questions and having you think about how you want your business to operate and function.
Okay. So for every small business owner out there, I kind of go back to, if you think about the PPP loan, one of the things I think we all learned was there are some fundamental things we need to have in place in order to have even been considered for a PPP loan. You talk a lot about the legal structure, but are there any other fundamental things that a small business should know or should think about having in place legally in order to really build a strong foundation, not just for protection, but for growth?
Right. Yeah, I think in addition to, once you have the legal structure, you have to make sure, and that's what we help you do as your attorneys, or anyone you hire as your attorney will help you get the legal documents you need, right? So if you have a limited liability company, you need an operating agreement. The operating agreement is the agreement that shows what the agreement is between the owners. If it's, for example, you and your husband. And so we help you all draft that agreement and come up with the terms. And so many times, for example, a bank, if you're getting a loan, will ask you for the operating agreement or the bylaws if you have a corporation, so that they can actually see who the owners are of the company.
Okay.
So it's important to have those sort of fundamental documents. And then in addition to that, I always tell clients that it's really important to make sure that your finances are in order. So you need to have some sort of payroll system. If you have employees, you need to have a CPA or an accountant, doing the reporting for your business. Because what happened with the PPP loans, and the reason why we weren't able to help some of the businesses that came to us, was because they didn't have their financial records in order. And so our office is trying to work with different partners that can help small businesses with that aspect, because you can have your legal, you can have your legal structure and everything in order, but if you're not actually, doing the reporting on the financial front, then it's going to make it more difficult for you to get a loan, for you to qualify for a PPP loan. So that's my other bit of sort of tip, have your finances in order as a small business. And I know it's difficult, but it's important to have those advisors on hand, and someone who's supporting you on that front.
Absolutely. So I'm a small business owner. And I'm in what I consider to be scale up mode. I've just completed a growth plan. I will say, probably, if I'm to be very candid, I did not think through or include in that growth plan where and when I should meet those legal requirements. If you could share a little bit about, we talk a lot about the pivot plan on this show how people had to during the pandemic and still beyond are having to pivot and in order to survive and thrive. Um, Legal usually does not come up in those moments. Why is it so imperative that at that time we look at seek legal advice? And what are some of those things that we should be including in that growth plan that we're just not thinking about, or we don't even know are things we should be looking at?
Yeah, I think having in your growth plan a budget, and even if it's a small budget for legal fees in the event that you'll need an attorney, I think that's important to include.
Mhm.
And we always even tell our nonprofit startup clients, they're groups of people who are trying to make a difference. But at the end of the day, you're running a business when you're running a nonprofit, even though it's not a
Mhm.
for-profit business,
Mhm.
all the same legal principles apply.
Mhm.
So having, a budget for legal is important. And I would say when you're doing this pivot and you're going to be changing your operations, like so many businesses had to do that during the pandemic.
Mhm.
For example, we know that a lot of businesses had to transition from maybe selling at a brick and mortar, or maybe they were selling at markets in person, to now they're all of a sudden selling online, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
if you have a website, or if you're selling through Instagram, or I don't know, whatever marketplace you're using online, you have to make sure that you understand what the terms of
Mhm.
of the platform that you've signed up with. You have to know, kind of just start to educate yourself around, well, what are the other legal issues that I could get into now that I've changed the way that I'm doing business?
You're right.
And I do
Mhm.
think it's important to think those things through before you just pivot and go. Sometimes people just want to go and do the thing. Um, but you really have to just stop and think and say, well, what kind of legal and sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? But
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
getting advice from, your family members, from friends, maybe from other business owners. And again, there's so many resources out there where you can really lean on people, I think, in this day and age, and get
Mhm.
different opinions from people. But definitely, I think the online world presents a different challenge because there are
Mhm.
so many legal considerations around e-commerce. So, that's sort of my 2 cents about that. It's like having some sort of budget in the event that you'll need an attorney. And I always say, if you can get the advice before you make the mistake, I think that's better. Um,
Mhm.
we have, there's plenty of, for example, I spoke to an employment attorney the other day who is constantly helping companies and employers with issues with their employees. And he told me, a lot of times these are things that they could have, they would have never been issues if they had just come to me for a consultation, right?
Right.
So it ends up costing you more on the back end. You
Mhm.
might as well just put the budget in on the front end and speak to someone.
So when you and I have talked about this as a small business owner, you have a limited budget, and even you yourself said, that you got to pick and choose where your money goes. Do you have to put an attorney on retainer, or is it a situation where you can actually hire as needed, but definitely develop a relationship so you have that ability to do so when you have those moments?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, ideally, you want an attorney on retainer, but we know that a lot of businesses just can't afford that. A lot of startups can't afford to have an attorney on retainer in-house, right?
Mhm.
So my advice is, I was talking to Stephanie, to you about this earlier. I have an acquaintance that I was speaking to about her transition from being employed at a PR firm to now running her own consulting company. And she was explaining that, well, she started out as a food blog, right? And she
Mhm.
was doing her food blog, and she also had she was also employed at this PR company. And she started to see that this food blog was really taking off. So she said, I'm just going to leave my job, my 9 to 5, and I'm going to start my own company. And so she told me that not only has she's in the last year, she's like tripled her salary, which I just thought was such an
Wow.
incredible success story.
Right.
And I asked her, so what do you do do you have an attorney on retainer? What do you do? And she said, I wish I had an attorney on retainer, but really what I did was at the onset, she hired an attorney to do the contract, her consulting
Mhm.
contract, which she uses with all of her clients, right? And so that's the same contract that she's using today. She herself will change it if there's some terms she has to change depending
Mhm.
on the nature of the client.
Mhm.
But I think the advice I can give you is to make sure that at least the documents that you really need for your business to succeed, right? You need something in writing with your clients about what this agreement and relationship looks like, making sure that you have someone do that legal review or draft it for you.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and I always tell clients, I don't know what your services are. I don't know what your terms are. So coming to the attorney with like even just a language about this is what I want this to look like is really helpful, because then they can help you draft the agreement. Like I
Okay.
want them to pay me in 30 days, or having those sort of terms worked out, and then the attorney can focus on all the legal, the legalese as we call it, uh,
Mhm.
so that it's an enforceable contract, and that in the event that you don't get paid or there's some sort of dispute, you'll be able to enforce that contract in court.
Okay. And I was telling Daniela, I actually did the exact same thing. I knew I couldn't have an attorney on retainer, but my contract is really solid, and I'm still using it today. It works for me. So yeah, that's a very good. Who knew I was following advice and I didn't have the advice yet? So you do a lot of work, as I read up on you a little bit. You do a lot of work in underserved communities.
Yeah.
If you could talk a little bit about um, what have you learned to be some of the differences when dealing with small businesses and clients in underserved communities versus those that have resources available to them, um, and maybe also share some examples of um, not specifics per se, but examples of you know what what we can learn from, if you're in underserved communities, some things that we need to think of a little differently as we move through this small business sector, because I actually am a business in an underserved community, and so there are a lot of things I've learned. If you can kind of give some guidance in that area as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, because I feel like I didn't grow up in an underserved community, and so to me I've been able to see the contrast of what it was like to grow
Mhm.
up. I went to private school in Miami-Dade County. I went on to I was able to go out of state for college, and it
Mhm.
was when I went out of state that I sort of broke out of my bubble and said, whoa, like the rest of the world did not grow up the way that I grew up. And I was able to make so many different friends from different backgrounds and cultures and socioeconomic groups, right?
Mhm.
And so coming back to Miami, to my home, and being able to work in different communities and connect with people that I wouldn't have otherwise connected with has been such an amazing experience. And I think what I've learned or what I've seen is that the reality is that the people who are growing up in affluent communities, who have parents who can sort of fund their children's, whatever crazy business idea they have, these are
Mhm.
people who, yeah, they
Mhm.
have, not only do they have access to professionals, they have access to capital. Um, they also maybe have gone to business school, right? We know that there are so many
Mhm.
business schools out there,
Mhm.
so people are getting training.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and in the underserved communities that we're working with, we see that we don't have the same access to capital. We don't have the same access to community. There's not as much, we don't have the wealth building
Mhm.
that was
Mhm.
built in other communities because of slavery, racism, just racism towards different cultures and people. So here we are today, people are starting out at different levels. And I think it's
Mhm.
important to understand that that's why it's so important for a small business owner in an underserved community to make sure that they're doing everything correctly, and using the resources that are available to them, because you're competing with another. For example, if you sell carrot cakes, you're
Mhm.
competing with another, maybe young woman or man or person who is also selling carrot cakes but has all the access that maybe you don't
Uh-huh.
have.
Mhm.
So, and I don't say that to discourage people. I think if anything, it shows the resilience of underserved communities, and we've been able to see so many successful small businesses
Mhm.
come out of these communities and I think that just understanding that you have to make sure that you're legally compliant, because you may have a great business idea and you may be doing a great job, but one lawsuit, one
Mhm.
issue could
Mhm.
totally throw you off. So I hope that sort of answers your question, Stephanie.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Actually, and it tapped on something with regards to wealth building. I think when you and I first met via the phone, this subject came up, and it's something I don't think, in particular, businesses, small businesses, and underserved communities think about. But it's that wealth building. What are I think I shared with you at the time I was at a workshop where there was a lot of talk about, or I was talking to someone about the importance of renting a building. I personally think if you can put yourself in a position to buy the building, you've now just created an asset for yourself that if you sell the business, that's something else you can add to the pot to make more money.
Right.
That's where I think of wealth building when it comes to business owners. I mean, to at thinking as a business versus as an individual. If you could share some examples of what you think a small business should be thinking about when they're putting their growth plan together, that could lend itself to that wealth building dynamic. Um,
Yeah, that's a great example. I think thinking about that, the growth plan is not supposed to be what do I need to focus on today or tomorrow or 2 weeks from now. It's really what does my plan look like 5 years from now, 10
mm,
years from now. And it can be difficult to sort of, we talked about this, how I'm even trying to do this in my career, trying to create a plan for myself. But I think at the 5 and at the 10-year moment, or even 20 years down the line, you have to think about sort of these milestones and I think it comes back to what are your goals, right?
mhm,
And they don't have to necessarily be economic goals, but for example, I want to hire 5 people in the next 2 years, right?
mhm,
If you have a goal in place, then you know that you're going to have to get some, if you've never had employees before, at least having been an employee, that there are many regulations and laws around
mhm,
hiring employees and making sure that, they're classified correctly, not, whether they're independent contractors
mhm,
or if they're employees, you have to withhold taxes as an employer. So if you are able to create at least what your goal is, then you'll be able to, people who are here to assist you. And if you need to go see an attorney or talk to someone at one of these small business incubators, they'll be able to help you navigate knowing what your goal is, right? Because
mhm,
then you'll know, well, I should save some money because I'm probably going to have to go talk to an employment attorney, get any contracts I need in place. I also think that going back to wealth building, yeah, definitely. If you can have in your plan, I want to eventually buy a building. And I'll give you an example. My mother is a Cuban American immigrant, but she came from Argentina, raised with a single mom in Miami-Dade County, ended up putting herself through law school, and now she's a successful business owner herself. She runs her own law practice, and she eventually bought her own building, and now she has tenants, and that's like
mhm.
an extra income she has. And it
Oh,
wasn't,
wow.
yeah,
Wow.
it's great, and she has this beautiful little tiny building in Coral Gables, but she's really one of my role models. But what I'll say about that is she had been renting for a very long time. It's obviously a lot of
Mhm,
money to have a commercial lease. And so eventually this was sort of like the next step for her. She had enough capital where she and
mhm,
get a loan, and she said, okay, I'm going to buy this building, and it worked out. Um, and it wasn't necessarily a part of her plan, but it's sort of like the natural next, it was like the next thing to do.
mhm, mhm,
So I
mhm,
think, and then the last thing I'll say about wealth building is when we're doing your initial documents for your company, thinking about what does the wind up look like for the company. Like, are you going
mhm,
to be passing this company on to your children?
mhm,
How do you want this to end? And there's a great quote that I can't remember exactly what it says, but you kind of have, when you start something, having the end in mind. Like,
uh-huh,
what's my end goal here? Even if it's 50 years down the line, what is the end goal for this business is really important.
mhm,
And I'll just give you one example. I worked with assisted a small business who wanted to sell his company. He was a restaurant owner.
mhm,
He wanted to sell his company to the chef who had been working there for 25 years.
Wow.
And so that was a beautiful moment because he said, this was always part of my plan. I never wanted to run this business forever. He had an operating agreement that an attorney had drafted. And so it made the transition very simple. And he was able to, you know, pass the company on to this chef who then took ownership and management control. So those are sort of my thoughts around that.
Okay. I always, especially again in underserved communities, I always challenge myself in those spaces is how are you thinking beyond just sort of this hamburger? What
Right.
does this hamburger mean 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road? And I think that's something that we don't think about because it hasn't been in our purview. It's not something we've seen. It's not something that we know is happening. So I think that's a very important conversation we need to continue to have. So you talked a little bit earlier about how, and you're right, like sort of all of this stuff is at our fingertips. I myself have Googled documents before and downloaded them and tried to use them in some small capacity. Do you find that you have a lot of, kind of self-made lawyers who have downloaded some document show up in your office and say, you need to do this because they say to do this in Google? You know, how do you encourage people to balance what they're seeing in the world in the online space and what's really what you and your experience in this particular market? What conversations do you have for us that suggest, it's wonderful, yes, you have this stuff at your fingertips, but it's not the end all be all answer to what you need specifically?
Yeah, I think that's really important, like a very important point to highlight, because you're right. You can just Google a document and use it for your own purpose, but it's important to understand that, you don't know where that document came from. You don't know what the specific intent or goal behind it was. So I always tell people, those, like, take everything with a grain of salt, right? Like, I've seen people come in and they have a perfectly good contract that they got from LegalZoom, and then they just want us to sort of rework it, revise it. So I think it really depends. And I think you need to know yourself. You need to know your business goals and purpose well, and sort of use these tools, but also just be aware that they're not the end all be all, right? And really having someone who can review whatever agreement you may have found online, and give you actual legal advice on it is just, you can't replace that with just getting it off of Google. And again, I understand that a lot of people don't have access to it, but like our shop is free legal services for low to moderate income entrepreneurs. So I know that we exist. I know that there's other resources out there where you can get the legal help you need. But just be wary of what you find online. And again, I'm a Googler myself. I think it's important to sort of survey what's out there, but just realizing that it's not a one size fits all ever, because every situation is going to be different. And on that note, I'll just say, because one of the tips I wanted to leave everyone with is really everything needs to be in writing. If you're going to be a partner with your husband or your best friend, or maybe just whether you know them very well or you don't, there has to be something in writing. I had to work with two entrepreneurs who were starting a business together. We were doing their operating agreement. They got in a fight. They were very good friends. They got in a fight. And then I had to help them basically dissolve the company. So you never know what's going to happen. You don't know if you're going to get a divorce. So the point is, you want to make sure that you yourself protect yourself in any agreements for the company, because you never know what could happen. So everything has to be in writing.
Well, and to your point, actually, I'm thinking of a story that I'd heard from actually a young lady I was talking to, who owned, I believe it's a cupcake business, and later learned that she had an aunt that sort of stole her recipe and then started her own business, caused a great deal of family friction. is there any recourse she could have had at that point, or what should she have done from the beginning to protect herself in that way? Is there any way to do that when you're dealing with a recipe, or
That's a good question, and I know that you had an intellectual property attorney on, but,
Mhm.
the recipe is, in my mind, if it's and I love cupcakes, so I love this example. Um, but if the recipe is proprietary information, right? Like it's a secret recipe, let's say, and so that really can be considered a trade secret, right? Like she doesn't
Mhm.
want anyone finding out what the recipe is. She doesn't want anyone to sell the recipe because that's her special thing, right? So
Mhm.
you have to go through measures of protecting that information, making
Mhm.
sure that employees, family members, other owners don't steal that recipe. And so I think, again, there would have had to have been an initial agreement. And I don't know what capacity the aunt was in the business,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
there has to be some agreement if the aunt was part of the business. And then, unfortunately, you know, attorneys can't prevent these sort of things from happening.
Mhm.
We do our best to ensure that we're creating a contract that you're gonna be able to enforce in court. But a lot of times, it's not realistic to go and sue this aunt for
Mhm.
for what she did, and sometimes there's just not going to be the evidence that you need to get the recourse that you want. So it's important to understand that. And I will say that just having listened to many podcasts with small business owners, no one can do what you do the way that you do it.
Mhm.
So even if someone is trying to copy what you're doing, or because nowadays people can steal things online all the time and steal content,
Mhm.
right? That's
Mhm.
copyrighted and that you've created. But again, no one can do, and unfortunately, we've had to help some small businesses with people who have maybe stolen trademarks or whatever sort of
Mhm.
product. Maybe they're completely copying a product. But again, I always tell them no one can do what you're doing the way you're doing it. And I really believe that if you're doing what you do best, then you're gonna ultimately succeed. But it's a lot of heartbreak to have like a family
Mhm.
member or even an employee steal from you.
Mhm.
The other thing is non-disclosure agreements and making sure that if someone does have access to the secret recipe, for example, that they promise that they're not going to, have them sign an agreement that says they're not going to disclose any of your proprietary information,
Mhm.
including this recipe or whatever other confidential information you may have.
Mhm. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I guess we're just saying we need to make sure that we include legal in some of the decisions that we make. Even as you mentioned, we should definitely have a budget. So now I'm going to have a budget now. I don't shy away from going to legal. I just don't have a budget.
No, I get that. I get it.
Exactly.
And it's definitely, it just has to be just being aware that everything you do in the world creates a liability, right? Me driving my car creates a duty for me to be respectful of the people on the road. There are rules you have to follow the same way with a small business, right?
Mhm.
You can't just be
Mhm.
selling food out of your kitchen without really knowing, like, hey, am I allowed to do this? There's something called
Mhm.
the cottage food law. Do the foods that I'm selling fall under that law? So
Mhm.
just and that's why I always tell people, we talked about this, the business plan is so important, because if you come to an attorney and say, this is my plan, and like, give me an outline, a consultation of what am I going to need, right? What are the
Mhm.
sort of agreements I need to actually get to my goal? What sort of advice do I need, etc. So having a plan is important because
Mhm.
it can help your advisors help you.
Thank you so very much for this feedback. I've learned some stuff, of course, and I'll be calling you soon. Before we leave, I would like to ask you, how would somebody get in touch with you if they needed to start up or scale up?
Sure. So our website is flcommunitydevelopment.org. And if you want, I can post it in the chat. Should I do that?
Yes, please. Hey,
Okay.
Tracy, how are you? Tracy is one of our small business owners, so I hope you're getting her information, Tracy, because she's wonderful. She's definitely going to help
Hi,
uh,
Tracy. So
with your
you guys,
legal.
you can apply for our services on our website, and someone from our office will be in contact with you. And if you qualify for our services, we set up a consultation, and we see if we can assist you. Typically, if for some reason we can't help you, we will always refer you to another. There's resources on the Florida Bar website. There's a referral service there. So we'll always refer you to someone or an organization or something that can help you. So at the very least, you'll get that from us. So feel free to apply it on our website. And if you're not in Miami-Dade, we do this project that Legal Services has, the Florida Community Development Legal Project. It's a statewide collaborative project. So we're working with legal aid providers in Orlando, in the Bay Area, in North Florida. And so just be aware that if you're not here in Miami-Dade County, there may be attorneys near you that may be able to assist.
Okay. Thank you so much for doing this again. I think it's a great way for us to start a new season with people starting out and getting their documents right. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Stephanie.
You're welcome. Have a good one. So everyone, thank you for tuning in today. Again, I can't stress enough the importance of having a relationship with an attorney who can help you through your legal concerns as a small business owner. You will face some, trust me. So it's a good idea to start contacting people today. And Legal Services of Greater Miami, I've worked with, they are wonderful. So I really do highly recommend them. Our next guest next week is going to be Natasha. I'm sorry, I got to get her name right. Mateer. I hope I said her name right. She'll correct it for me next week. That's going to be Tuesday, January 18th at 10 a.m. She's with JNCY Jewelers, a fine jewelry company. I'm very excited about that because I've always been intrigued by fine jewelry. And hopefully she'll show us some of her pieces and how she does her work. I will see you next week. I thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great day. Bye-bye.